Today, I got to have a lovely discussion here during Judaism January with Rabbi Beth Lieberman. Beth is the literary editor and revising translator of the JPS Tanakh Gender Sensitive Edition, also known as the Revised JPS or the RJPS. Now, immediately, I can already tell some people see these words, gender sensitive edition, and alarm bells start going off because unfortunately, in our society right now, the language of gender has become a hot button, politically charged issue. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have Beth on to talk about this new edition of the JPS. I saw it at SBL. I talked to the folks at the booth there last fall, and it really interested me. I wanted to see for myself what the updated JPS, Jewish Publication Society translation consisted of. So JPS was kind enough to send me a copy, and I actually have to put that this is a paid endorsement in the video description, even though I'm not getting paid anything, but they sent me this actual copy, which has monetary value. So technically, that's why I have to put that. So when I got it, the first thing I did was not look at my favorite verses, but I went to the preface and I wanted to read what they were trying to do, what the purpose of this translation was, why it came about, their translation philosophy, and the goals and the aims of this new JPS edition. And once I did that, then as I read through it and looked at some of the passages, the decisions that they made that might have been a little jarring at first made a lot more sense. So I was so happy that Beth agreed to come on and to just talk a little bit about not just this translation, but some of the history of Jewish Bible translation. You know, it's Judaism January here at Disciple Dojo. And so we want to, every year during January, we focus specifically on Jewish authors and scholars and thinkers and resources. And the goal is for viewers, whether you're a Christian, whether you're Jewish, whether you're agnostic or anything else, to come away with a better understanding than you had before of what all is involved in this case, Bible translation. So Beth was a gracious guest. We had a great discussion. I look forward to having her back sometime and us talk about other issues that have to do with Bible translations, the different perspectives, particularly between Christians and Jews. This is just all part of what we do and what we want to encourage here at Disciple Dojo. So if you're into that and you think it's a good thing, then we would love for you to subscribe if you haven't already. And stay tuned in this discussion because Beth is going to give a code where you can go on the website and get a copy of this new Tanakh for 40% off. 40. Yeah, not 5, not 20, 40% off. That's pretty awesome. I didn't ask her to. When she told me about that and asked if she could share it with viewers, I said, absolutely, because if there's one thing Disciple Dojo viewers love, it's big discounts on biblical resources. So sit back and enjoy this discussion with Rabbi Beth Lieberman of the Jewish Publication Society. Rabbi Beth Lieberman is here with us, and Beth is not the first Jewish guest we've had on the channel, but the first rabbi that we've had on the channel. So that's exciting. And this is Judaism January here at Disciple Dojo. Every year we try to put a special emphasis on works by Jewish scholars, thinkers, authors. And so I reached out to, actually we got connected through someone else, and they sent me a copy of the JPS Tanakh, Gender Sensitive Edition, also known as the RJPS. Just came out, semi-hot off the presses. And Rabbi Beth Lieberman here was now I'm going to get the title wrong, what's your actual title? Because I put it on screen. It's a literary...
It's a mouthful.
You tell the
Literary
viewers.
editor and a revising translator.
Literary editor and revising translator. So I'm going to ask you about what each of those aspects are in
Sure.
just a bit. But tell Disciple Dojo viewers who you are. What kind of rabbi are you, and where are you located, and do you teach somewhere, and just, yeah, introduce us.
Sure. So I am a scholarly rabbi, meaning I work with books, I work with scholarship, with teaching. I am an instructor at HUC, which is Hebrew Union College on the Los Angeles campus, which is where I'm based. And I have been for many years working at the intersection between Jewish scholarship and the literary world. I actually came out of a book publishing background. I used to be a book editor.
Oh.
So I combined my love of literature with my love of Bible to kind of get into this project.
Were you raised in a religious home, and what type of Judaism? Reform, conservative, Orthodox? Like, for those who are, because we have, I don't want to assume viewers are well versed. Some viewers are not, and they have a lot of questions about. That's part of Judaism January, is wanting to kind of de-weird some of the religious stuff that is outside of people's tradition. So, give us a quick snapshot of your journey, how you got to where you are.
I was raised in a totally secular home, but Jewish, but basically going to synagogue once a year on the high holidays. And I became very interested in exploring my Judaism and deepening my connection to it when I became an adult. So I started studying it. I started working on books having to do, that were for this market. And then it was rabbinical school.
Was there, did you feel like what, because people ask me, like, why did you go to a seminary, or what made you want to do that? And for me, it's different than for other people. Everybody has their reasonings. But so what made you, there's a difference between exploring and connecting with one's Judaism and becoming a rabbi. Like that seems like it's another step.
That's true.
And so what made you take that leap?
Well, my love for the religion and the tradition is so deep that I really didn't want anything about it to be foreign to me. And in order for that to happen, I had to learn a lot more than I had been raised with. And once I started learning, I thought, I could teach this.
Right.
Part of what I started to do was I worked on fiction, historical novels that were kind of based in like either the Bible or Jewish commentators. Like there's a series of books called Rashi's Daughters, which is a fictionalized what if account of the 11th century scholar Rashi. He was French, and his three daughters. And that was kind of my way in through the literature of it.
I love that you just said, I didn't want any part of it to be foreign to me. That's a really profound way to, there's a lot of people for whom many elements of their faith is foreign and stays that way. And when you ask them, why do y'all do whatever? And they don't know. That's a really cool way to think about pursuing rabbinical studies. I like that.
There are a lot of ways to practice Judaism too, right? As there are Christianity, right? In terms of, and depending on where you are and what movement you're part of and what denomination and all that.
Right.
My family is from all over the place. I have a sibling. My brother is modern Orthodox, and there's a true, not a truism, but I'd say this happens kind of in the Jewish community, which is that particularly in America, but it's happened kind of in a lot of countries. You have one generation who's extremely religious, and then the next generation, the one they raised, not at all. They won't have anything to do with it, right? And then their children then sort of want to return, and they return in the way that it makes sense for their generation, which is actually what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be we're supposed to be interpreting the tradition anew for each generation.
There's a belief among, not a belief, but I guess it's kind of just a stereotype among Christians that Judaism is monolithic, which is having grown up around and having Jewish friends and knowing the little bit that I do about Judaism has always been like, no, there are very different ways and beliefs, and there are even different Jewish translations of the Tanakh. When you translate anything into English, you have to make choices and decisions, and those are going to be reflected by where you come from and your stance. And that's what I wanted to have you on to talk about, is your role with the RJPS. I'm just going to call it RJPS, since that's what the editors asked me to do in the beginning of the preface. And I think it's a great way to distinguish it between JPS, NJPS, and then now the...
Well, JM, it's the official academic name. So if any scholars are citing it, they call it the RJPS.
Yes.
So that's kind of where
and we want to, we're big about biblical scholarship here in Disciple Dojo, and so that's what we're going to set the tone from the beginning. But it is called the JPS Tanakh Gender Sensitive Edition on the title page. And so that's going to be the big, let's open that can of worms right up front, and then we can talk a little bit about your role. Gender sensitive edition, immediately some people are going to look at this and go, finally, and they'll pick it up with reverence. Other people are going to look at this and go, what nonsense are they trying to peddle now? So there's going to be, because people are very particular about their Bible translations. So right off the bat, tell us, what is a gender sensitive translation of the Bible?
Yeah, I would love to. Although I also want to talk about the history of Jewish translations of the Bible and how
let's do that to segue into it then. That's the perfect segue.
Okay. So Christian Bibles tend to be based or derived from the Greek translation of the Hebrew, which is the Septuagint, done in the 3rd century BCE in Alexandria, and it's called the Septuagint. I'm sure you know this because supposedly there were 70 scholars, each sitting in his own room, and we know they were he then, so that this will factor into my gender-sensitive conversation.
All right.
Translating the text, and then they were compared, all 70 versions. So that's the myth of it. We don't know if it's true, but it's the narrative. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Hebrew Bibles, as opposed to the Old Testament. So Hebrew Bibles, which are specifically Jewish for Jewish use with religious study and religious practice and study, are based on the Masoretic text, which was codified around the 9th century. Mm-hmm. There have been translations of the Hebrew Bible for Jewish communities in, basically every country over the years. The King James Version, right, in the 1611, I think. Yeah, 1611 is when it was published, was the best known and the most beloved of the English language translations for centuries. And what happened in the U.S. is that the Jewish community the Jewish community has no supreme body. Like we have denominations, but we don't have anybody who's sort of like, aside from those denominations, who's the authority.
There's no Jewish pope.
There is no Jewish pope, and we could use one probably at times, But we have, here in the U.S., there are many, many denominations. So, and there always have been some from kind of the beginning of when our communities came over. So we differ significantly in practice and belief. Mm-hmm. In 1917, the publishing house, Jewish Publication Society, put together a multi-denominational team of scholars to produce a Bible for kind of all of the American Jewish community. Right. And it was very impressive. It was the first of its kind. It's predominantly a word-for-word rendering of the Hebrew, which is one way of translating, and it was strongly influenced by the English style of the King James Version.
Yeah.
And this served as the standard translation of many of the American Jewish community for many decades. I still have my family Bible from 1917.
Oh, wow.
It has it has all the handwriting. It was given to my grandmother by her rabbi, and it's really kind of cool.
Yeah.
So we revere all of these.
Yeah.
In 1955, it became time to revise this translation. Because, society had changed and language had changed. So another multi-denominational scholarly team got together under the auspices of the Jewish Publication Society to produce the NJPS. It took 30 years for this translation to be done and published in its entirety. So it was very thoughtful. Mm-hmm. It was before computers, obviously, before AI for sure. So
yeah, I mean, even just before thinking about before Word documents and our word processing, how laborious it was to publish anything back before. It's just, I mean, I'm old enough to remember having to write things out and using card catalogs and that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
We just
think of all that paper.
Exactly. And comparing and indexing and, yeah. So
it took a long time.
It really did. So the 1917 JPS, and then in the 50s, they said, we're going to do that, but because things had changed. Well, let me ask you, was there anything scholarly that had changed in Christian studies? The update between the American Standard Version, around 1901, and then the Revised Standard Version, it was a big part, the discovery of things like Dead Sea Scrolls and biblical archaeology had become a discipline especially in the early 20th century. So that for the revised translations in Christian tradition, that was a big part of why, in addition to, like you said, language changing, mid-century English being different from, 19th and early 20th century English. Did that have any role in the NJPS that you know of?
Well, that's a great question. Yes, something had there, but something different, actually. So, yes, there was more scholarship. There were Jewish studies had kind of arose, which it didn't really exist before, in the way that it was multinational. And so more American scholars, English-speaking scholars, knew the Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And what they could do is they could go back to the commentaries, medieval commentaries, and pre-modern commentaries, and take what were specifically kind of Jewish scholars and apply that to the translation in a knowledgeable way. Mm-hmm. So there's an example of this. So Bereshit bara Elohim, just the beginning of Genesis, in the King James, and in the 1917 version of the JPS, it is translated as, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth."
Right.
So in the 1955 to 82 edition, or 85, it's slightly different. It's when God began to create heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. The reason is that Bereshit, in terms of its form in the Hebrew, is really a sort of continuous action rather than strictly in the past. And so they were able to kind of say, oh, there's another way to look at this. So let's do that. Mm-hmm. And then a little further down, just in the next verse, the 1917 reads, "Now the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters." Now, the Spirit of God, which is beautiful, it grew into a Christian's kind of theology. Mm-hmm. And because of that, the concept of spirit never really made it into Jewish tradition from there. So Our translation is now, and this is the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water. So we translate ruach as wind or breath, although given the verb that's used for sweeping, it's actually like
Avian, bird, hovering imagery.
Yes,
It's marachatha,
yeah, it's used.
I think, is the
Yes,
for a bird circling. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
There's some changes like that, which are kind of, I mean, they're kind of interesting. And the other piece of it is that it's not a word for word translation. It's which we also call mechanical. It's idiomatic. It's sense for sense, meaning.
Right.
We take the meaning of what the verse says, and we translate it into the target language in a way that makes sense for that language.
Right, not reproducing the words themselves. And this is something viewers are a little familiar with. We've talked about it before, but it's always worth coming back to. Is translation is as much an art as a science, and there's methodology when it comes to translation theory that starts before you ever start doing any translating. You have to decide: is it more important to reproduce as close as possible the form of the original language into whatever receptor language, or is it more important to, like what you're talking about, find the meaning of what it meant in the original language, and then find how you would say that meaning in the receptor language, and then just say it that way? And for some people, one or the other is anathema, and they're completely against. And that's where you get the tribalism of translations, and people, don't ever buy this Bible. Oh, this is the terrible translation. And that just continues to this day. And I've reviewed a number of Jewish translations here on the channel earlier this month, so I know that it's not just Christians who find reasons to differ in translation with others and how they've handled the text.
We all do it.
Yes, absolutely.
We all do it. And, in terms of other Jewish translations, so you probably, and I don't know what you've been doing specifically this month. There are other
I'll tell you real quick so you can know. So we've reviewed Art Scroll, Tanakh, the Koran, English Tanakh, RJPS, NJPS, which is in my Oxford Jewish Study Bible, Robert Alter's translation, and Everett Fox.
Oh, my favorites.
And then the CJB, which is a Messianic translation. So we've looked at all of the just had a video where I'm like, we're just going to read a passage. I think it was from Genesis. I can't remember. It was from Genesis 2. We said, I'm going to read it in each translation. And to get the feel for it. And we used the RJPS. And I said, hey, by the way, guys, we're going to be talking to one of the people involved with this pretty soon. So we plugged this episode in that episode.
Nice.
But yes, those are
I hope some of your listeners are coming from that and have heard that and now can hear this, right?
Yeah, so can reinforce a little bit of their understanding of why there are differences in translations. And I'm interested particularly from a Jewish perspective, because all of my work has been from Christian perspective. And so I know why certain Christians want to handle things in certain ways usually. And I can sometimes tell somebody's theology from how they render a certain path. Not all the time, but sometimes. But I've never been able to sit down with a Jewish friend and have those kind of discussions.
Oh, great. Well, I hope you're going to teach me too. So I'm going to
ask more than I teach for sure. But
what I'm sorry. I can tell you about the different translations.
Give us your take.
I
would love to hear your take. How are they characterized from a Jewish perspective?
Well, the Koran and the Art Scroll are Orthodox. They come from an Orthodox publishers, basically, and so that informs not only their readers but their their translators and everybody who works on it, they have kind of a more literalist view of the text, I guess. The individual translators like Robert Alter and Everett Fox bring their own scholarship and, certainly in both cases, literary virtuosity
Right.
to how they represent the Hebrew text in English, and they're all quite wonderful in their own way. What sets the JPS apart is that it has always been cross-denominational. So we've always had scholars working from pretty much across the denominational spectrum on these translations, and they're academically they're created specifically to be used by the academic market as well.
Right.
So that's why it's in that's why the Oxford Bible will license that text, is because it has the authority, I guess, in a way. Which makes it, you talk to somebody like Robert Alter and he'd say, oh, well, the JPS editions are kind of bland compared to mine. And that's fine. I'm not going to speak to that so much. They're definitely treading the middle road, in many ways. What our translation really has sought to do is to open up the biblical text. So rather than, we're trying to provide access to the richness and the complexity of what is there in the Hebrew. We don't prejudge, and here's where we get gender sensitive. We don't prejudge whether God can be described as male. We're making it possible for the deity to be understood and encountered in many ways. We're kind of empowering readers to make their own interpretive decisions and to have their own religious experiences. So one mission, though, that we had, our highest goal, was to hold a consistent portrayal of God's unity and therefore gender neutrality. There's a reason why we've done this. So the reason we've done this also, it's been about 40 years, right, since the last JPS translation. Right. And the English language has changed, not totally, but it's changed so much, particularly in what we call a generic, calling the male a generic. Some of us say man or mankind when we mean humanity, and that's they're perfectly comfortable with that. And some of us want to say humanity, because if you say man or mankind, it means only men. And this is just a change in the English language. It's not a change in theology. There's nothing in the Hebrew Bible that mandates that God is male. There are plenty of disagreements among scholars as to whether that is indeed the case, but our position in terms of this translation is that we don't know. And God is supposed to be without body anyway, so it is perfectly truthful to portray God without gender. Not always, though. So here's where we get into, I'll get into some of the metaphors, because we didn't really change everything. Right. Gender sensitive is, what we mean by it is that we've been attentive to how gender and language function in the Bible. The Bible uses masculine grammatical forms in Hebrew because Hebrew is
the Hebrew language.
Gendered.
Yeah.
But English is not that way.
Right.
So,
well, let me give just a quick example for listeners who maybe this is all new and they don't know what do you mean? What are you talking about? I can understand my grandparents and great-grandparents, and when I read their letters, I understand. What do you mean the language has changed? I think a great example in pop culture, and this is nothing new, the original Star Trek, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Star Trek: The Next Generation, beloved show of all Trekkies out there. What did they change it? To boldly go where no one has gone before. And it slipped right in, exact same meaning, but in the 60s, you still had, you could say man, and everybody understood that it was gender neutral. But that was not the case, and fastly becoming not the case by the time of the mid to late 80s. And so they made that change. And it wasn't a major thing, but for some people it was. Some people will make anything into a major change. Where people start getting nervous, maybe, and you can tell us the RJPS's approach to this, is that there are some kind of we'll call them, I know in Christian circles, they're not even Christian really, they're usually like projects by individuals, but there's some kind of rogue translations out there that will start talking about mother goddess instead of father god, or images in the song, like they'll literally change things, not to remove or to like move it beyond gender, but to just switch genders. And it just becomes a silly thing that's totally foreign to what the Hebrew text said. And that's not, at least what I was reading, that's not what I see RJPS doing. You're talking about the introduction to it, talks about gender sensitive. And let me use this to have you kind of riff off of this. I think it was is in the intro. Phyllis Bird had a quote about the aim of the Bible translator, and it should be to reproduce what the original hearers would have heard or readers would have read. And then so it says in the intro, in sum, the revising translator strove to make gender no more and no less of an issue than the text's original audience would have perceived it. Unpack that a little bit. What does that mean? No more or no less of an issue?
Well, one good example of that is the word avot. If we're talking about the patriarchs who are referring to their inheritance of their avot, it could very well mean ancestors. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily have to mean forefathers. And so in those instances, we changed forefathers to ancestors. Mm-hmm. In other instances, we did not. Like, for instance, there are a couple of examples in the prophets where the use of the word avot has to do with kind of clear territorial kind of masculine authority, and in that case, we kept it as fathers, mm-hmm. or patriarchs, because that was what it was clearly meant to be per the society that was being depicted, mm-hmm. And written for.
And for viewers also that don't know Hebrew, av is the word father, and so pluralized avot becomes fathers. And so what we're talking about is, would they have heard fathers as in male authority figures, or would they have heard, like in America sometimes when we talk about the founding fathers, or countries that talk about fatherland in a more generic sense, would they have heard, like you're saying, ancestors? And RJPS is operating from the perspective that in some case-by-case basis, right? In some cases, they would have heard ancestors. Yeah. In some cases, the fatherhood is actually what the original hearer would have picked up on. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you totally. I mean, and another example of this is the word king. So, if you were talking about a human king or a human ruler, and not a specific personage, then we tended to translate melech as sovereign, just because we wanted to kind of open up the ideas.
Do you think that there's any for English speakers? Because I've thought about this when when I'm doing translation of any Hebrew book of the Bible, and I come to Melech, immediately in my head I just go king, because I've like drilled it in vocabulary for so long that it just means king. But then I think in my head, as an English speaker, I think of king as golden crown, long robes. I think European king. I think of like King Charles, or and it's hard for me to separate that from Melech in the Hebrew Bible, which would be suzerain, like ancient Near East king. And so in the teaching a lot, I have to consciously bring that out. Otherwise, we just import our own notion of royalty, and especially in modern times, especially Americans, that royalty is like, we started this country to not have a melech. So
Right.
does that play any role? Does that ever cross the mind of Jewish interpreters or yourself or anything? Or is it more, or am I just the weirdo in associating the king with King Charles? Because that's all I think.
I think that's natural. I mean, I really do.
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about Lord in a few minutes too, which kind of gets into this too.
Yeah, Lord is a British royalty title.
Right.
And we speak English, like England. So of course our words are going to, derive from these concepts. But
yes, and our theological concepts also. I mean, our theological beliefs, right? So yes, God is the sovereign over all of us, right? So we all kind of many of us ascribe to that. But do you have to say Lord? So, and I'll get to that when we talk about the Tetragrammaton and how we represented that.
Yes, because that's another key difference.
Yeah, it is. But would it be okay if I give a couple of examples?
That'd be
kind
perfect.
Of like okay.
Yeah.
So Genesis 1, if we go to verses 26 to 27, in the 1985 JPS translation, it is, and God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in his image, and the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. That makes sense. I know it makes sense to all of us. But what it does is it makes a few assumptions. It makes, that male is the generic in terms of humans, or that God is male. And so if we look at the New Translation for the same verses, they change it like this. And God said, let us make humankind in our image after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created humankind in the divine image, creating it in the image of God, creating them male and female. Is a translation for our time. It is meant to be not that shocking.
Right.
How does it strike you? How do you think it's going to,
This is something, when translations of this passage in Genesis are something that Christians also have wrestled with. And everybody has to figure out, what do we do with, how can it be, you of course recognize the poetry, the parallel, but tripartite poetry of God created Adam. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So that image of God, by the time you get to the third line, it is male and female. They're both reflecting God's image. And so you have to wrestle, okay, so then who is the he created him? Well, it's not him. If it's male and female, him must be both genders. And it must be a generic he. And in English, we don't have it. Like,
I say maybe because were you talking Genesis 1 or Genesis 2? So that's another question, right?
Yeah, Genesis 1. Genesis, just in the text of Genesis 1. The Hebrew, it cannot be referring to only male, because in the next line it's going to say what it's referring to, male and female. So Adam collectively must be humanity, is the Adam. And it's... And I like the way this is worded. The question I would want to pose, if I were being critical, and this I think is an English problem as much as anything, is the second line. I don't have, turning the perfects into participles. That's, to me, that's just a grammatical thing, and that's not a big deal. But he created it in the image of God. Where I struggle with that would be, we don't really have another option. We have he, she, and it. So which one do we choose? Well, in this case, I see the logic behind choosing it, because it's both he and she. So we got to have something. The problem that I have is, in English, it is a dehumanizing, like it's actually considered rude to refer to someone as an it. It's seen as dehumanizing them. So, but we don't have there's no other option.
Well,
in this text,
what I want to point out here is that the it actually refers to humankind.
Collective.
So, the collective. So if you're talking about a collective, then you can say it, like the people, Israel is an it. Mm-hmm. It's not a them, or the citizenry of the United States. Mm-hmm. It's a body, kind of like. So that's that's how we hope it's going to be. I mean, that's how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to refer to that.
Yeah. I get that completely. I'm not, it doesn't confuse me. It doesn't, like I said, I don't have a problem with it. To me, it just brings up more of what I think is a problem with English, is that it's harder to find, because you might say, well, in the next line, it's them, male and female. So why not just use them in the second line? God created them in the image of God, male and female, he created them. But then you run into the translation question, because the text doesn't use a plural. It uses a singular.
Right.
And so this translation is this constant juggling of what's the best way to word this. And then you do it, and then you bounce it off people, and are like, well, I haven't thought of that. Let me, it.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to translate even simple passages if you're really going for broad usage.
Yes. And you know how long this translation took?
Well, did they get started right after 85, and did it immediately start working on?
No, it didn't get started that soon. It basically was a 20-year process.
Yeah.
I was not involved for all 20 years, but one of our lead project editor, David Stein, was involved with doing this with Torah. Mm-hmm. And we kind of worked from that text as well for the 5 books of Moses.
It's a long, for sure. Time. It's a long process. Yeah. And it's a lot of wrestling, and it's a lot of, in Jewish translations, is there, I know in Christian, like some of my professors worked on the NIV or the CSB or other translations, and they would talk about sessions where the translators would, whoever they're going to get to do, let's say Micah, everybody does their translation of Micah. And then the committee comes back together, and they go line by line and, okay, what'd you get? What do you have? What do you have? And then they talk and debate it. And every now and then there's someone in the committee who is adamant that a particular reading is contextually correct and the others are not. And they get outvoted. And usually I feel like I think it was Walter Kaiser was telling us, if they are, the degree to which they are adamant is the likelihood that it will get included as a footnote variant, like possibly this or Hebrew uncertain.
Yes.
Does that happens in Jewish translation as well?
It does. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's less though a matter of the translation committee, than it is a matter of what commentators over the centuries have written. That we still use as study text, if Rashi said one thing or Ibn Ezra said another and had a particular, authoritative interpretation, then we'll include that if it's vastly different, for sure. But there are a fair number of terms that the last JPS translation did not translate, and they just said Hebrew uncertain. Mm-hmm. And in the 40 years since that was published, archaeology, sociology, biblical studies have discovered about the societies, ways in which people were living and tools they were using and all that. And we were able to actually translate some of those, which were just Hebrew uncertain before.
Right. And linguistics too, cognate language studies and Ugaritic studies. And here's an Ugaritic word that is almost exactly the same. And in this context, now you have more usage of it. And so you can make a better educated decision, the translators, of what this actually was referring to. So the RJPS does it more with, there's some technical terms in especially liturgical settings or musical settings, right? That has a little more, how does it handle that as compared to the NJPS?
Well, there are a couple of great examples of that. In Leviticus, there are many, and other places, but a lot in Leviticus, the references to the sin offering, the chatat, we don't translate it as sin offering. We translate it as purification offering, because sin has the connotation of something that we understand to be, they probably didn't have that concept of sin that we associate with the word now. And so it's more of a sort of a technical term, or what has been discovered and written about in the past few decades is that part of the culture, Israelite culture, was that the women would be kind of the musical celebrants after a military victory. So they would come in Exodus, when Miriam is leading in song. And she uses timbrels. Or the women are also meeting King David as he returns. Instead of timbrels, we know them to now be hand drums. So hand drums is what was used. I mean, this is probably boring to a lot of people, but for us, we love this stuff.
Yeah, well, it's important, because I grew up thinking, and there's even some English translations, I think, that say something like Miriam picked up a tambourine and started, and it's like, as a little kid, you can do that in a reenactment in your church or your synagogue or whatever with a tambourine, but that's not what, a hand drum is a very different thing, and it gives a different feel. Yeah. And it also, it avoids kind of an anachronistic understanding of what it is. And that's important. I mean, some people might consider it minutia, but the world of scholarship is about minutia, because without the correct minutia, you can't arrive at the full understanding that then gets presented in a sermon or a lesson or a Torah reading discussion or something like that. So the details matter for sure.
Now, my dream for some time in the future is for somebody to figure out how all those musical instruments in the Psalms can be translated. What are those?
How do you, let me ask you, I'm wrestling with that right now, because here at Disciple Dojo, we're teaching through the Psalms. We just finished Psalm 21, and we're teaching through the Hebrew text. And I always have to put not a disclaimer, but at the beginning, I always have to say, when it comes to Mizmor David or Lamnatseach, I just, we're 20 Psalms in, so at this point, I don't even mention it. But in those early episodes, I'd have to say, now, we know what Mizmor means, but La David, what does the La mean? To David, by David, for David, about David, concerning David. And then Natseach, who is the Natseach, choir master, the director, Septuagint translated it as for the end. So completely different understanding. So that,
Yeah.
what do you do with that? Who do you think you think choir master? I didn't even look. I should probably look and see what RJPS has.
Yeah, see what we did.
You have. I'll tell you right now.
The jury's out. The jury's out on it.
And I know I've looked at enough commentators to know that everybody's to some degree. Yeah, for the leader.
For the leader is what we
just went with leader.
And but what is an asaf? What is they probably were kind of get hints of that there were families that were or guilds of musicians.
Mm-hmm.
Men and women, they were not just one or the other. And so that's all we know. I mean,
right.
But there are still parts of the Jewish tradition, right, in the Orthodox community who believe that the Psalms were written by King David.
Mm-hmm.
And they were really composed over, according to scholars anyway, scholarly consensus is that they were composed over the period of 500 years by a variety of people. So can we talk about the name of God?
Yes, absolutely. How did you guys decide to, I just did it. I just said you guys. How did y'all, I'm from the South.
Right, y'all.
Tell viewers about the process, because Christians aren't as reticent to try to pronounce them. I mean, even when they get it wrong and say Jehovah, there isn't that reticence of pronouncing the Tetragrammaton, which there is in Judaism. And it's a very old tradition, even possibly back into New Testament times, that was a practice. So,
oh yeah.
It is a big deal.
Yeah.
The different Jewish translations that I looked at handle it differently. Lord, Hashem, sovereign, there were different ways they did it. So let viewers know the rationale behind the RJPS approach to the Tetragrammaton.
Well, God is referred to by a number of names, and some of them are Elohim or El Shaddai. There's Eloah, there's some other ones too.
Mm-hmm.
But the Tetragrammaton is God's personal name, and it appears 6,828 times in the whole Hebrew Bible. And it's a personal name, so it's God as an agent who directs, acts, speaks, and is spoken to.
Mm-hmm.
And we do not know what it means, and we have no idea how to pronounce it. I mean, the most widely accepted explanation among scholars connects this name with the Hebrew verb hayah, to be. But ever since the days of the Second Temple, so that's your timing was right on, spot on with that. I mean, Jewish tradition has forbidden anyone from pronouncing the Tetragrammaton aloud. And so all we say now is a substitution. I mean, there are stories in the Talmud about different rabbis who pronounce the Tetragrammaton aloud, and horrible things happen to them.
Right.
There are all sorts of crazy stories.
Well, that's one of the things that I believe in the Talmud says all Jews have a place in the world to come, except, and then it gives a list of exceptions, and one of them is pronouncing the name. It's really a big deal. Yeah.
It's really bad.
Yeah.
So, the way that Jehovah came out, I mean, the other thing is, how do we get Lord? I mean, I'm sure you know this, right? Mm-hmm. So that Jewish scribal tradition established an alternate substitution of the Tetragrammaton of the 4 letters. Okay. And that substitution is Adonai, which the Greeks translated as Lord, Kyrios, right? So that's what we read today. I mean, we read Adonai in Hebrew, Lord in English, and they're derived from that. They're just substitutions for the name,
right?
The unpronounceable, ineffable name of God, which I think it makes sense in that it's as unknowable as the divine presence itself. Oh, I used it. How do you like that? Now,
Right? We just can't avoid
where do we
these
go
things
with
in
that?
English.
But how to represent the Tetragrammaton was a huge point of discussion for us. I mean, we spent months trying to figure out what to do. We looked to rabbinic commentators, scholars, translators who have thought deeply and written a lot on this matter, and there's no widespread agreement about how it used to be pronounced. So what we did is we decided to honor Moses Mendelssohn's 1783 translation into German. First, we honored Samson Raphael Hirsch's the way the typographical treatment of his translation was handled, which was that when you have the name of God to represent the Tetragrammaton, it is typographically distinct from all the other letters. So we use God. I mean, the answer is we use God, but the God is kind of in small caps, so it looks different.
Yeah, it's all all caps for for all of whenever you render the Tetragrammaton, it's always in small caps, right?
Yes. However, the word God is not always in small caps because sometimes it's God by another name, or it's Adonai Elohim. And then what do we do with that? We don't want to say, we had to figure out how to kind of make that sound good.
Right.
So that's where Moses Mendelssohn's translation came in, where he represented Yud He Vav He as, now I'm going to get this wrong because my German pronunciation is just terrible.
It's better than mine, so go for it.
Der Ewig. Yeah, I'm sure it's totally wrong. But I know to spell it, so it's Ewig. And that basically is kind of like, it's reminiscent of Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is what God said to Moses when speaking from the burning bush. I will be who I will be. I am who I am, like Popeye, and in the not Popeye, who's the
Popeye.
sailor. Popeye says that.
I am that I am.
I am that I am. And we basically, we translated some of that into the eternal. So when it's a reference to God, but not the Tetragrammaton itself, it's often the eternal God is how we kind of decided to do it.
And there's in the preface on page, let me check my Roman numerals, 17 XVII, there is a little comparison and letting readers know these are the different ways RJPS as compared to NJPS has treated these different passages. This is one of the reasons that I tell viewers, I've said this in some Bible reviews, it's astounding how few people read the prefaces in their Bibles. And people that are really passionate about certain translations, like for instance, in Christian circles, we have a pernicious segment of Christianity called the King James Onlyists. And they will argue that King James translators were divinely inspired by God to render fully, definitively, and perfectly in English the Bible for all time, and that is the King James Bible, not the King James Version, the King James Bible, KJB. Okay. They get real. I get comments from them on the channel sometimes, and they're super adamant. And yet, the King James preface, the translators will say that they don't think what they're doing is the best. It's the best they can do, and they encourage. They commend previous translations, and it's completely different than the dogma that certain elements within Christianity have attached to it. And it's like, whenever you read a translation, and there are people that are that way, not to that degree, that's the extreme, but there are people that are that way about other English translations like the ESV or the NRSV, especially if they're more scholarly. They're kind of NRSV snobs, or the new NRSV UE, the new updated edition. And people get really passionate about translations, but they don't always, at least it seems, many of them don't always read the preface to those translations that tell, why they made the decisions they made, or those who attack other translations. And that's something else that's common, is people attacking translations they don't like. They never read the preface to that translation. And so they just assume, oh, you don't use the word Lord because this is a gender sensitive edition and you're trying to, they just immediately ascribe motive without understanding the rationale.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to have you on the channel, to kind of talk and get into the nerdy translation weeds a little bit on these things. And also so people could at least understand or hear directly from the source, the motivation behind making these decisions. Like in the preface, you talk a little bit about why it's important that the Bible not alienate people unnecessarily. That gendered language, and this is, there's no way to not, it's a culture war that's raging right now. Like the pronoun wars.
Oh, yeah.
And
sure.
And any side somebody takes, they're going to get jumped on. This translate, when I was reading the preface, I was wondering, okay, how much of this cultural English American, not even American, because it's in Great Britain and Australia and others, Western, how much of this Western paradigm is driving this versus the concerns that you talked about when somebody reads a text that constantly is saying, let him, let he, him, and a little girl is sitting in synagogue or in church hearing is just thinking like, what does this say to me? How do I relate? Like that's a very legitimate thing to wrestle with. Absolutely. Regardless of whether somebody goes one way or the other when it comes time to the translation.
Well, when it comes down to it, that is exactly who our, intended reader is over time, the generation that is now rising up, right? And how do they perceive the language? Because we really care about them. We're not just like doing this as an academic exercise. It's right. This is, in my part of my involvement with this project as a rabbi is that I'm sensitive to how the language influences the formation of personal theology. Right. So just as you pointed out.
It's something, it's a needed and it's an important, what I want to convey, because I don't know where I land. Like I translate for the moment. So if I'm doing a teaching here on YouTube, I tend to be very woodenly literal so that people who are following along can see like the structure of the language and, but then when I have to preach something, let's say I'm preaching rather than teaching, then of course I'm going to be more colloquial. I'm going to try to put it more into the language. And then if I go teach in like India or Japan or somewhere that's a completely different context, then I have to take into account, okay, how's my audience going to hear what I'm saying and make sure I'm on the same page with my translator so that they don't hear something that I'm not saying.
That's complex, and that gets complicated too.
Yeah, factoring in cultural context matters, and the RJPS is, if you read the preface, you guys are open about we are intentionally trying to let people hear the Bible without the baggage that English gendered language inevitably brings up. And I think that's a good goal. Whether I end up agreeing, oh, this is a good translation in this verse or this, or that, to me, that's immaterial because translators will
Yeah.
always disagree. Five
Yeah. And,
translators will have six opinions.
and we're just doing the best we can, like everybody else.
Yeah. It's an interesting translation. If for no other reason than then your readers are able to hear that rationale, or they're able to hear a translation using that rationale, and then they can compare it with Koran or compare it with Art School or something, and
Yeah.
I think that's the answer for skeptical readers. For readers who don't know anything about it, I think they could jump in, pick it up, and start reading. But for people who are like looking askance at a new translation, one of the healthy things to do, compare it. Just sit, read it, compare it with others. Is this being used by Safaria?
That's a great question. So, in fact, this has been licensed. Safaria is like a co-publisher.
Okay.
So it's all on Safaria. It's one of the translations. It's called the 2023.
Okay.
JPS.
I remembered reading in the preface something about Safaria, which I've told viewers about here on the channel, a great online resource. For those of you that don't know, Safaria is a wonderful wealth of rabbinic and biblical Jewish resources. In a lot of it in Hebrew and English, some of it only in Hebrew, or maybe Aramaic, but a lot of it in English. And it's right at the click of the mouse, which is pretty amazing.
It is. Although if and I think Safaria is, I mean, if you can change the translations, you can go compare them too. So, have some fun with it if you do go on. And, if you also if you're interested in the print version, you can also go on the publisher's website. There is a discount code. Can I say what it is?
Dojo viewers love books and they love saving money on books. So tell them how they can get, is that for this copy?
It's for this copy of the 2023.
Which comes in, here's his.
You go onto the Jewish Publication Society website, find this version, click on the page, and then you can get 40% off with the code. Yeah, that's a pretty nice discount.
Whoa,
right?
That is.
6AF23. So 40% off with 6AF23.
Dojo viewers, we will put that in the video description. So if you're watching this on your phone, tap the title. It'll drop down. We'll put the link to the website, and then we'll put the code so that you can save 40. That's almost half, guys. That's almost half. So there's no reason to not at least check it out and have a scholarly Jewish translation. Especially if you don't have one, then what are you waiting for? I want to look real quick because I know we're a little over an hour. Are there any other difference? I know there was this edition. There are more footnotes than in the previous edition. Why? And is that important? And why do footnotes even matter?
Well, footnotes are kind of for those of us who like to kind of geek out on it.
That's you're in the right place with this channel.
It'll basically tell you what what we have found to be the latest scholarship. For instance, there are words that still haven't been translated, and we'll put in a couple of notes about what commentators have said.
Right.
Or, they actually are being translated. Like, no, they aren't. Like the word teraphim, which is one of my favorites.
The household gods, household idols.
Yeah, exactly. They were never translated in the previous version. In the previous,
I didn't know that.
Translation. Yeah, they're always called teraphim.
Oh, interesting.
Nobody knew what they were. But archaeologists have basically found that they were household idols. You know, like for family household oracles. I think we call them household oracles. And so some of the notes will kind of explain why that is. And also the notes will, if it's a minority opinion, as Jan mentioned, it will say others. The indicator is a footnote that starts with others say, which we love minority opinions. That's it's so important to kind of keep them in the conversation no matter what.
Yeah.
Now, I do have a favorite verse, which if we don't have time for me to read it, I'll just tell you what it is, and maybe you could.
No, we absolutely have time for you to read it. I want to give an example real quick for listeners that I just glanced down. There are the notes. One of the things that the notes do is they incorporate. I'm looking at a note. I just randomly opened to 1 Samuel 14, and on that page there's a note that gives the reading from both the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll. And then on the next page, there's a note that gives from the Targum and the Syriac. So the notes, it's not like you're just getting, this is what the Masoretic text says only, but this does take into account. And I just happened to turn the page, and note F on 1 Samuel 15 is oracle idols.
There you go.
Figurines, apparently with a human form, used as a medium for divination in household settings. See Ezekiel 21, Zechariah 10. It's a perfect example, and I didn't even plan it, of what would have just been in the original text. It would have just said teraphim, and the reader is left to figure that one out. But there's more of an emphasis on explanatory. Now, it's not a study Bible. They're translator notes. They're not study notes, but they are giving a little bit of background at times when the text itself doesn't, when it's unclear. Much more than the older version did. The older version was fewer footnotes. So, yeah, viewers, just be aware of that. I think it's a great thing. I'm pro footnote. I'm vehemently anti endnote. I think endnotes are the worst thing ever invented. Footnotes are the way to go. Put it on the page so that people can see it and not be flipping back and forth. And this translation does a great job with footnoting, especially compared to the others. So what was, you said your favorite verse?
My favorite verse, I'm glad you asked, is Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. So in the previous edition, in the 1985 JPS, and I have all the other, by the way, all those other Bibles that you talked about, I've got them all on my shelves. Like,
you're not anti. You're not like, get them out of here.
And the NRSV I have as well. It's so Isaiah 6:1 begins, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly." Don't ask me who the he is, okay? Because we're not totally sure. I think they're seraphs. "And one would call to the other, 'Holy, holy, holy, the Lord of hosts. His presence fills all the earth.'" Now, this is sacred to us because it's part of our liturgy, part of our daily liturgy. This also these verses. So it was really, and it was very tricky to. Can you imagine making this gender neutral? So this took many discussions.
Right.
And I want to thank my translation teammate Job Jindo, who actually came up with what we call the winning translation on these verses, which is, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my sovereign seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of God's robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance, each with 6 wings. 2 covering the face, 2 covering the body, and 2 to fly with. And one would call to the other, Holy, 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 God of hosts, whose presence fills all the earth. That is just an example of what I call English language pyrotechnics. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, people are going to feel differently about it, depending on if they love the way it sounded, sounds in other translations. But I'm very proud of this one. I think it came together well.
Right. Well, and in reading it and hearing it, the only thing, there's nothing of substance has changed theologically, because there's still no question about what he's seeing, what Isaiah is seeing, and the power and the magnitude. And those for whom the constant he pronouns referring to God or to the seraphs would be a distraction. I think that's a case where the aims of your translation were achieved. If somebody agrees with the aims, then they're going to be like, yeah. And if somebody has a problem with those aims, then they're going to be like, I don't like it. But you do what you set out to do is done, and it's done with a very well-known passage, which you get into trouble when you mess with people's memory verses.
Oh, would you ever?
Well, how long, let me ask, when, we'll wrap it up, but how long has this been out? I saw it at SBL. Was that when it, how had it been out before then, or was that its preview release? Its publication date was October 1st, 2023. Okay.
And so what happened in our community, in the American Jewish community, and on October 7th, just eclipsed everything. Mm-hmm. And so we're it's almost like it's new. And right. So you're the first person I'm talking to, and a year and a half, maybe 2 years about this. Mm-hmm. So because I have presented to a couple of schools, and some were before it even came out. But we're just kind of like
the marketing aspect of it.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
So, yeah. In the scheme of Bible translations, one year is not. It's a short period of time.
Oh, right? Yeah. Yeah, I still refer to the NIV 2011 as the new NIV, and it came out in 2011. So, right. In Bible translation years, this thing is you guys haven't even cut the cord yet. It's still on the delivery table. It's just come out.
Yes.
But I wanted to look at it, because I had used, and I do use, the other JPS, both older JPS editions. When we teach through the Psalms, we have a translation comparison in Logos Bible software. Are there any talks about this being available in Logos or Accordance or any of the kind of biblical? I know Sepharia, which is great. Has there been any, do you know any? Because people are going to ask me this. And so if you don't know, I'm happy to.
Yeah, the answer is not yet, but we hope that it will. As far as I know, it's on the radar. It's on the publisher's radar.
Yeah, that's great. Well, especially in this age of digital age, the more platforms translation is available on, the more use it's going to get and exposure. So that's really good.
I'm glad you asked. I have so appreciated being able to talk to you and have this conversation. And to, thank you for asking me to do this. And
thank you for agreeing. I'm excited to have you in, and it's. Disciple Dojo, I'm a Christian. This is a Christian ministry, but we teach, and my focus is Hebrew Bible more than, New Testament, because I'm a Christian, but seminary focus and my own reading and learning is skewed more towards Hebrew Bible, because Christians don't know a lot about it, honestly, and it's a big chunk of mystery material for a lot of Christians, even those who have gone to their church all their life. So having Jewish perspective to me is important, because we're going to see things that the other doesn't. We'll disagree, of course, and that's something, Disciple Dojo. The reason this ministry this channel is Disciple Dojo. I'm a martial arts instructor. I teach jujitsu to adults and kids, and one of the things that we do when you do martial arts, and especially jiu-jitsu, you go in and you spar. You really spar. Like I tell people my best friends are the ones who try to regularly choke me or break my arm. And because we're doing it with the mindset of we're sparring, so when something starts to hurt, you just tap and they let go. And then you shake hands. You're like, all right, you got me that time. I'm going to get you next time. And what it does is it creates this not antagonism, but a little bit of adversary, like in a good way, an adversarial relationship that makes each person get better. And I really do, Disciple Dojo really does try to exhibit that approach theologically. So whether it's other types of Christians, like I'm going to have, after Judaism January, I'm going to have a Catholic friend, scholar back on, and we're going to continue to talk and dialogue about some of his work. And so I want to, and you can let others in the Jewish community know, it's scholarly, people who have done works on commentaries and translation and stuff, that they're welcome to come on and step into the dojo, and they're not going to be like hijacked by a Christian gotcha YouTube channel or something like that. Like the goal is genuine discussion, because that's what society needs. And so having people are going to, I know for a fact, because I can already see some of the comments, that people are going to dismiss anything with the word gender in it. And that's just an unfortunate byproduct of our cultural mindset. And so I wanted you to come on, because I don't want them to do that with this translation. Like I want them, if you're not going to like this translation, I want you to not like it for the right reasons, which is you disagree with something, or not for just, because they use the word gender sensitive and you think that has to do with wokeness and snowflakes and all of these other buzzwords in our culture, because it really doesn't. As Beth has talked about, there's a ton of work that has gone into this by some pretty dedicated scholars for decades. And so, agree or not, in the end, it's worth considering, and it's worth reading and looking and seeing and having an informed discussion about it. Even if that ends up being an argument, at least it's informed. Beth, do you have...
Next time we'll really get into it.
Yeah, I would love... So one of the things that I'm going to do, because viewers, when I did the first video comparing the different translations and I read Genesis passage, there was I did a whole section. I did Deuteronomy 29 as well and read it in each of the different ones. But the video would have just been too long, so I ended up cutting that and just doing Genesis. But I've thought about doing a series of taking passages that are of particular note to Christians from the Hebrew Bible and reading them in Jewish translations.
Oh, that sounds great.
Getting like, how does this so I would we'll be in discussion, maybe have you back on and
I'd love it.
Talk us through some of the rationale and some of the areas. Yeah, thanks. It's nice to sit and chat with you. It's good to hopefully we can meet face to face, but Zoom to Zoom is the next best thing. Do you have anything coming up that you're either working on or that you're kind of focused, even in terms of this translation, like what's your goal right now? What are you trying to do for the publication to help get this out there?
I'm having a lot of conversations. We're going to be doing some, going to be offering with a colleague of mine some Zoom teaching scholars in residence about this translation. And I'm also teaching seminary students right now sermon writing, homiletics, and I tell them they've got to use the 2023 translation.
You're not biased or anything. You're like, I'm not biased at all, but
I mean, if they don't want to, if they don't like it, they have to give me a good reason.
There you go.
They have to go to this one first.
That's a fair approach. Is if you don't like it, that's fine, but you got to tell me why and make your case.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. Well, if viewers are interested and they would want to get in touch with you, like to follow up or to ask a question or to be directed to somewhere that somebody could answer questions about this translation or where is a good place for them to do that? Do you have any social media? Do you have a faculty page? Do you have a publication author page?
I think the best place would be to send me a note, reach out via my website, which is rabbibethlieberman.com. And I would love to hear from you, any of you who want to continue this conversation some way.
Is a contact form like on your
There is a
website?
Contact form.
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Dojo viewers, let's show the good rabbi some love in the comment sections and by reaching out to her via her website.
Thank you.
Is there anything that we did not cover that?
I have some other favorite verses, but I can save that for another time. And that could certainly be for the comparison translations.
All right.
That you talked about. But you're so knowledgeable and you have what a wide range, that you bring into it. It's just been a pleasure.
Well, I'm as a YouTuber Bible nerd, it's fun to sit and chat with somebody on the inside who's actually doing the nuts and bolts work of getting translation out there. So I very much appreciate your time, Rabbi. It was great having you in here, especially during Judaism January. And so I'm going to put all of the links and even the 40% off code. That's a huge discount. We're going to make sure we stick that in the video description. So viewers, make sure you check that out if this interests you. And it was a pleasure chatting with you. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. And you guys you're good with the fires and everything. How far has that been from you?
Yeah. Well, fire season, has extended beyond what it used to be.
Viewers should know we had to bump this interview a couple of days. Like we were supposed to do this a week ago, but because of the fires in LA, you had to be evacuated or it was a warning evacuation. Is that right? Yeah, I was yes. My family was our home was under evacuation warning. So I was basically packing up, our essential things in the suitcases and getting ready to head out of here if the fire department said go. Right. So, but you didn't have to. Everything's good for right now. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Yeah. So far, so good. So far, so good. Well, God willing that it stays that way, because I know it hasn't been for everyone. And folks, keep praying for everyone out there in LA dealing with that. But thank you so much for taking time this afternoon for me, morning for you. Really appreciate you having you here in the dojo. Thanks a lot. Once again, I want to thank Beth for stepping into the dojo. It's great to be able to sit down and talk to somebody who's not just a rabbi, but also a scholar who's immersed in the world of biblical translation. If you're interested in picking up a copy, again, we're going to put the link in the video description below with the code for 40% off that Beth shared. So thank you so much, Rabbi Beth Lieberman, as well as the Jewish Publication Society. If you appreciate this discussion, again, if you haven't already, go ahead and click that subscribe button. That helps us have more discussions like this here on the channel. That'll do it for now. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more here at Disciple Dojo. As always, in the meantime, keep training.